Good evening, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar titled Union Budget 2026-27 and the India-US Interim Trade Agreement, Convergence, Contradictions and Consequences, conducted by the Peninsula Foundation. My name is Anupama. I am a research assistant at TPF and I will be your MC for the session. Before we begin, I would like to outline a few housekeeping rules. Participants, please ensure that your microphones remain muted throughout the session unless you are invited to speak. You may post your questions in the chat box during the Q&A session, which will take place at the end of the discussion. Today's session will be recorded and uploaded to TPF's official YouTube channel. So we request that you refrain from sharing any snippets without prior permission. With that, we will now begin. Thank you. Presented on 1st February 26, the Union Budget for the financial year 27 outlined India's fiscal and strategic roadmap amid global uncertainty. Projected 10% nominal GDP growth, 6.8 to 7.2% real GDP growth, a total expenditure of rupees 53.47 lakh crore, and a fiscal deficit target of 4.3% of GDP, seeking to balance consolidation with infrastructure-led expansion, youth-centric investments, defense modernization, and strengthening global partnerships. Days later, on 7th February, India and the United States announced the framework for an interim trade agreement. While the US has agreed to reduce tariffs and provide India preferential access to the 30 trillion US dollar market, India has committed to lowering tariffs on US industrial and agricultural goods and significantly increasing imports over the next 5 years. However, key provisions are still under negotiation and the finalized agreement is set to be signed next month. Currently, many questions are being raised on competitiveness, domestic industry impact, energy sourcing, and non-tariff barriers. On these lines, today's webinar will seek to provide a concise overview of the 2026-27 Union Budget and critically examine its key priorities. It will analyze the major takeaways from the India-US Interim Trade Agreement, including its underlying provisions and implications. It will assess the Union Budget's capacity to manage the impacts of the India-US Interim Trade Agreement, highlighting areas of convergence and divergence between the two. And for this, we have an esteemed speaker joining us today, Professor Arun Kumar. Professor Arun Kumar joined JNU in 1984 and he retired as the Sukhmoy Chakravarti Chair Professor in the Center for Economic Studies and Planning in 2015. He was formerly the Malcolm Adiseshaiah Chair Professor in the Institute of Social Sciences. He has a PhD in economics from JNU and a master's in physics from Princeton University, US, and Delhi University. He is specialized in development economics, public finance, and public policy and macroeconomics, and has contributed to public discussions on policy since 1980. Professor Arun Kumar has also authored several books such as Indian Economy Since Independence, Persisting Colonial Disruption, The Black Economy in India, Indian Economy's Greatest Crisis, Impact of the Coronavirus and the Road Ahead, and so on. Welcome, Professor. Our moderator for today's session will be Air Marshal Matheswaran, founder and president of the Peninsula Foundation. Sir is the former Deputy Chief of Integrated Defense Staff, Tri-Services Command, and was the Senior Air Staff Officer of the Eastern Air Command earlier. The Air Marshal has had an active service of 39 years in the Indian Air Force. He holds a PhD in Defense and Strategic Studies from the University of Madras and is a Senior Fellow in International and National Security from the Harvard Kennedy School of Governance. He writes frequently on aerospace and defense issues, geopolitics, and national security. I now invite Matheswaran sir to take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Anupama. That's a good overview. And I welcome Professor Arun Kumar. It's always a great pleasure to have you with us. And it's also a great honor to have you as our distinguished fellow as well. The topic is extremely important, and as the budget was released, I think within a short while, the Indo-US trade deal was also announced. And as we discussed on the plan, Professor said both will have an interrelationship or will have an impact on how things are viewed. But let's first look at the budget itself, and this budget looked like, the finance minister delivered the longest speech in a budget delivery session, and but the text of the budget or the real structure of the budget doesn't inspire anything great. It appears to just maintain status quo, no major reforms or no major fiscal changes, but to consolidate what is existing at the moment and move along. And of course, while she has focused on fiscal deficit reduction as well as on increase in the capital expenditure, I suppose there is also, thanks to Opsindo, its impact is showing up on an increased outlay for the capital expenditure in defense as well. But by and large, I think there are no major incentives in terms of healthcare or education or in terms of social security aspects. That's one part. And the second is then comes the Indo-US trade deal, and what would be the impact on all the aspects of the budget planning and then budget implementation. The trade deal appears to be a sellout of India's some core interests, which is what we need to examine. Now, of course, with the US Supreme Court decision, much of that remains in hands and balance. But we need to probably correlate the two. And you can't have anybody better than Professor Arun Kumar, who's been talking extensively on this subject, to talk to us. So I'll request Professor to actually talk in the first 30 to 40 minutes, covering both the budget and also then move on to the trade deal and see how the two intersect and what will be the impact both positively and negatively for India, and what should we look for the future. Thereafter, we can actually move on to the discussion and then subsequently to Q&A. Professor, all to you.
Thank you, Air Marshal. It's a pleasure to be with you to make this presentation on this topic of budget and the Indo-US trade deal. I'll share screen and bring out my PPT. As an introduction, ever since Trump has taken over as US presidency, problems have been mounting both for India and for the world. This should have been expected because of the pronouncements that he made during the presidential campaigning prior to November 8 elections in the US. He was complaining that good jobs have been stolen by China, India, Mexico, and that he'll bring capital back to the US. So he was trying to say that, the US economy has been weakening and that the US economy has to be strengthened. So that's why his campaign was MAGA, Make America Great Again. The issue is that America was already great. It has one of the highest per capita income in the world. So what is the meaning of Make America Great Again? And this attracted even labor and, poor people to his campaign. So it should have been expected that he's going to change policies in the US, which will create problem for everybody. Now, I wrote a piece in November, basically outlining some of these things. Soon after he got elected in November, the results were announced on November 8th. I had written this piece. So the Indian government also anticipated that something like this could come. So in the previous year's Union Budget 25-26, customs duties were reduced on a number of items of interest to the US. India has been raising customs duties since 2015-16 in an attempt to actually improve manufacturing output in India, because it was felt that through that, we could raise employment generation in India, because India's manufacturing share of GDP is very low. But unfortunately, it has only declined rather than increased. So we did try to change that policy and reduced customs duties on items of interest to the US. PM went in February, soon after Trump took over on January 20th. He went and visited President Trump, and there was a talk that India-US strategic partnership would lead to a two-way trade of $500 billion by 2030, whereas currently it's about $145 billion. So there was a 350% increase over the coming 5 years. That is what was expected by the Prime Minister, and President Trump agreed to that. India also increased in the months soon after February. It increased crude oil imports from the US. It promised purchase of defense gear like fighter aircrafts, the fifth generation fighter aircraft, and so on, so as to reduce the deficit. Because President Trump was complaining that other countries are taking advantage of the US and have a huge trade surplus with the US. So to mollify Trump, we said that we will reduce our export surplus by buying crude oil, by buying energy, by buying defense equipment, etc. And our government thought that we are a strategic partner of the US, and therefore we could get favorable terms from the US. Unfortunately, that is not the case. What has happened is that high tariffs were levied on India, 25% and then 50%. And why was the tariffs levied were high? It is because India's red lines are agriculture opening up and import of Russian crude oil. Import of Russian crude oil at low prices was helping the Indian economy, and the agriculture sector being protected helps a large percentage of the population, roughly around 50% of population, which is dependent on agriculture. India's agriculture, is very crucial. In the US, roughly around 1% of the population is in agriculture. They can give large subsidies to that 1%. So an average subsidy apparently of $25,000 per a farmer is given. That amounts to roughly about, say, 20 lakhs of rupees, whereas an average Indian farmer earns only 1.5 lakhs of rupees. So the Indian farmer cannot withstand the competition from US agriculture in spite of the very low incomes that are earned. That's because of the subsidies given, the technology available to the American farmers, and so on and so forth. So now what has happened is that India agreed to an interim deal under which the tariffs were supposed to be reduced to 18%. But what has happened is that only a framework has been worked out. It's not yet an interim deal that has been signed. That was to be signed in mid-March, about a month later. So lots of clarifications were required because some of the terminology that was used implied that India would open up the agriculture sector. Clarifications were given. Similarly, India was supposed to get, it wasn't a $500 billion two-way trade as the February last agreement was, but that India would import $500 billion worth of things over the coming 5 years. That's a huge step up of import because currently the imports from the US were only of the order of about $45 billion. And that was to be stepped up to $100 billion average over 5 years, which means to starting with $45 billion, one might have to go up to $150 billion in the terminal year of the 5-year period. Also, it was a very one-sided deal because we were to levy 0% tariff on the import of Americans, but the Americans would levy 18% tariff on us. Now, these one-sided deals have been there all around, whether it be with Japan, with South Korea, with EU, and so on, that these countries would levy 0% tariff on America's exports, but their exports would face 15% tariff and so on. So with India also, this was very one-sided. It was not said what is it that the US economy would import, but it was said what the Indian economy would import would be $500 billion. Tariffs were also unequal. So in other words, a variety of reasons why people said that India has conceded a lot Also, India agreed that Russian crude would not be imported, and the Treasury Secretary was to actually monitor whether India was doing that or not. And if India was not doing it, then the tariffs could again be raised. So, in terms of duty, in terms of agriculture, Russian crude imports, etc., and the increase of imports from USA, we had conceded. Also, there was a clause in the framework which said there'd be balanced trade. Now, we've had a surplus with the US of about $50 billion, which has been helping our balance of payment. Now, if there's to be a balance in trade between the USA and India, then India would have to reduce its exports to the US while increasing imports from the US. And this would then damage our economy because our exports to the US would have to decline and our imports from the US would have to rise, both of which would impact our Indian industry. Also, both Trump and the Agriculture Secretary repeatedly said that with this framework deal, Indian agriculture market would open up. So even though it was denied later on, but this looks like a promise that they have extracted. And maybe that would come up when the interim agreement is signed in mid-March. So from framework, we have to go to the interim agreement in mid-March. And then from that, we have to go to the bilateral trade agreement, which will come after a few months. So there's plenty of time for things to change. And given the confusion that came with the framework of clarifications issued from both parties, it's very likely that certain things have been conceded, which at the moment for political reasons are not being stated, but which are very likely, and they may actually come up later on. Because there's certain vague terms that are used in there, when it is said that India would not levy tariffs on US exports. There are certain vague terms there. And under those vague terms, actually, things could change for agriculture. And if you look at it in August, September, India had reduced the tariff on import of cotton. Now, when you reduce the import of tariff on cotton, a lot of cotton came in, and the price of cotton decreased below the minimum support price. And that is what is worrying the Indian farmers, that the concessions given to the US may actually lead to prices falling below the minimum support price for other crops also. So which other crops may actually be getting opened up, or in which way that get opened up remains to be found out. So the fine print will ultimately tell us where the concessions are on agriculture. So even though at the moment the Indian government says that we have not opened up sensitive areas, but under pressure we've been acting, and therefore it's quite possible that we could open up parts of India's agriculture as well. So more changes are very likely, and the fine print is what we have to watch. Now, soon after this interim, the framework was agreed to, we have the US Supreme Court judgment, and that has upset all agreements, because all agreements are based on the so-called reciprocal tariffs. These reciprocal tariffs, I call them actually protectionist tariffs. Reciprocity has a sense of justice, that you will levy as much tariff as the other party is levying. So there's reciprocity. But actually, there's an unequal situation. As I said, the exports from US would have 0% duty, exports from India would have 18% duty, and similar things are there with UK, with the EU, with Japan, and so on. So these are protectionist tariffs. Why has this US Trump's tariffs been declared unconstitutional? The basis of that goes to US's independence movement 250 years back. It said that no taxation without representation, and that's why they wanted the independence from Britain, because they said we don't have representation in British Parliament. Why should we be paying taxes? So in other words, the taxation power resides with the Congress, not with the US president. So I had written in the month of May last year also saying that the courts may actually strike down, because the President Trump does not have the power to levy these tariffs. The power lies with the Congress. However, President Trump went ahead. The courts, the lower courts actually also said that president doesn't have that power. So finally, it went to the Supreme Court of the US, and there now it's been declared unconstitutional. So this has resulted in massive increase of uncertainty globally because EU has said that we will not accept this because what we accepted was different from what is being done now under Section 122 by President. US President under Section 122 immediately imposed a 10% tariff and the next day raised it to 15%, and this can be applicable for 150 days. And then he has other provisions also, like 301, but under 301 and other provisions, he has to actually have some kind of a inquiry as to what is the problem that the US economy is facing as a result of the trade that's taking place. And then only these sections 301 and so on can be utilized. So that'll take a bit of time and will take inquiry, and the Congress has to pass it. But it's very likely that the Congress may not pass them because these tariffs have been hurting the US economy through price increase, and that is going to affect the production in the US economy. And the congressmen face elections in November, and therefore they may not allow that to take place. So in other words, there's a lot of uncertainty as to what would be the tariffs. Will we go back to the earlier tariffs, which were on Indian products of roughly about 2.5% to 3%, rather than the 18% that is now in the framework agreement? And similarly, for other economies also, it might go back to 2.5%, 3%, rather than that 15%, 20%, and so on that has been levied. So in other words, trade agreements will be no more valid. So the question is, what next? Are we going to go back to the pre-Trump tariffs, or is something else going to cook up under 301 or various other provisions that are there? And President Trump has threatened nations that if they take action against this because of the US Supreme Court order, then he would actually take some action. President Lula of Brazil, who was in India, he has given the correct advice, which is that all other nations should bargain together with the US. This is something that I've been writing since last March, that all other nations, if they come together, so it becomes WTO minus the US, then the US would have to retreat very quickly because all other nations would levy tariffs on the US, so its exports would suffer. And even if Trump levies tariffs on the other nations will have surplus, which they can exchange with each other. So it'd be the US economy that will lose. So President Lula's suggestion is a very worthwhile suggestion to consider. Now, it is in this context that the budget should be viewed. So in other words, all this uncertainty is coming from the external environment. But there are also internal issues that have been plaguing the Indian economy. The external issues are like the weakening of the balance of payments of Indian economy, the devaluing of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar, and so on. This is a direct result of what President Trump's tariffs did, the uncertainty that was there. As a result, the investment in the Indian economy was low. The net foreign inflow of investment, that became negative. Portfolio investment was going out of the country, and that's what was creating the balance of payment problem. And that's why the rupee fell vis-a-vis the dollar, whereas the dollar was falling vis-a-vis other countries' economies. So rupee was falling against the dollar, but dollar was falling against the other currencies of the world. So in other words, Indian economy suffered because of the devaluation of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar, and since large amount of trade is denominated in dollar, it means imported prices rise, and that has an effect on inflation in the Indian economy. So balance of payments problem and devaluation of the rupee are a challenge that is there. Now, more than anything else, what it has done is aggravated the demand problem in the Indian economy. And demand has been short, and that's why the Indian economy's rate of growth has been affected. Now, my argument has been that the unorganized sector has been declining. So Indian economy is not growing at 6.5%, but more like 2.5%. And if you look at the capacity utilization data from the RBI, which is the data from the organized sector alone, not the unorganized sector. That shows that the capacity utilization has been hovering between 70 and 75%. And that's why private investment in the Indian economy has been a problem. And when private investment, which is roughly about 65-70% of the total investment, that is weak, then the overall investment is weak and the overall growth also weakens. So this demand problem in the Indian economy has been there, and that has been caused by the rising inequality between the organized and the unorganized sector and within the organized sector. So this gap between the organized and the unorganized sector is another problem that faces. So externally we face problem, and internally we face problem of rising inequality and inadequacy of demand. So it is in this context that we have to view the budget. A budget is required to deal with the current year's problems and take care of future problems. So the budget is, formulated in a given year. So the current year is running. So like, for instance, at the moment, the year 25-26 is running, is not yet over. So we know the data for 9 months on the basis of which the budget is formulated. And then we say, okay, if these are the problems that are being faced today, then how do we take care of them in the coming year, in 26-27? And are there likely to be more problems in 26-27, so the future problems, and what can we do about them in the budget so that these problems can be mitigated? So in other words, the budget is an important instrument for correcting the problems that are running in the economy and that can be anticipated for the future. Also, the budget is the largest single economic item of the country, and therefore it has a huge impact on the economy. So whether the budget changes direction or doesn't change direction, both have implications. If it doesn't change direction, then the problems will continue. If it changes direction, then the problems may get resolved. So some people say the budget doesn't matter, but I argue that budget matters hugely in the Indian context. Even if it is continuing with the policies that were there in the previous year, that still makes a difference, because then we will not be able to deal with the problems that are anticipated. Budget is also needed for development, because if you want to focus development of the unorganized sector as compared to the organized sector, then you have to change policies. So budget is needed for development. It is needed for a variety of things. For instance, the poor cannot get from the market what is required, and that's why they need government support. So increasingly, the poor in India are being given freebies of a variety of kind, because the political parties think that that's the way they can get vote. So if poverty persists, then the poor people need the government support, whether it be in terms of food grains, whether it be in terms of cash to women and various other things. So the question arises, why is government needed? Typically, in the public finance literature, it is because markets fail to deliver. Market failure is quite widespread in the modern day economy, and there are a whole range of things where market fail, whether it be increasing returns to scale, whether it be merit wants, whether it be public goods, and so on and so forth. So there are a whole range of reasons why government needs to intervene in an economy. And for the poor people, the provision of public goods and public services is very important, because that helps them to improve their standard of living. So public goods and public services could be like education, health, drinking water, and various such things. These are very critical for improving the standard of living of the poor people who live in India in rather uncivilized conditions. So what were the options before the finance minister? So if you look at the speech, it is a rather longish speech, and it has come after the longest economic survey 2026. And what she says in the budget speech is a bit puzzling, because it is not dealing with the kind of problems that people said were there before the economy. So there's a consensus as to the challenges that need to be addressed, whether it be of inequality, whether it be of the tariffs that President Trump has levied, the uncertainty created globally, the impact on export and import. All these things have been mentioned. So there is a consensus that these are the problems that need to be taken care of. And as I said earlier, the union budget was the right vehicle for addressing them. But when you read the budget speech, or when you heard the budget speech, you found a lot of promises, but the required action does not seem to be there. So why is the action not there? Because the budget had a clear choice, either to continue on the path being followed or change the policy of boosting the organized sector and not the unorganized sector. So one could have chosen the path that is already existing, or change the policies to reduce inequality. This was, a clear choice before the budget. In the present global scenario, exports and foreign investment are uncertain, as we've seen that our exports are not doing that well. In fact, they've not been doing very well for the last 10 years. And the great uncertainty which has impacted not only foreign investment, but internal investment also. So our focus needed to shift from export orientation to shift to focusing on the internal market, because the export market is not in our control. But President Trump's tariffs and various actions that have been taken by various countries, and because of the tariffs levied by the US, the various countries' exports to the US have actually declined, and therefore they have surpluses. So China has surpluses, and China could be dumping it on others. So therefore, exports become a bit challenging for everybody. So we also needed to shift focus on the internal market. In fact, EU has been saying that we need to bring capital back, just like US was saying we need to bring capital back. So, if countries begin to bring their capital back into their economy, like if you remember, President Trump said that, why should iPhones be made in India? They should be made here in the US. And similarly, on auto sector also, he's been saying that the auto sector should shift back to the US. So if the export markets are going to be difficult, we have to focus much more on the internal market, which is not to say we become autarkic, but which is to say that the prominence of the internal market, which has been decreasing over the last 30 years, that has to be raised again. That was also the attempt by the present government from 2015-16, when it was trying to protect the market by raising customs duties. So we need to actually focus more on the internal market, and I'll come back to that, how it could be done. Now, the trade issues that come up before us are that in trade, various countries attempt to capture markets. If they can capture other countries' markets, then their production goes up and their economy goes up. For the developing world, the argument is that our technology is weak, and therefore we are like infant industry. And that's why our industry needs protection. Otherwise, it would be swamped by exports from other nations, and therefore the industry would not grow. But then the question arises, for how long do you protect? And here lies the critical strategic argument that technology is not a static frontier, it's a moving frontier. So what was advanced technology day before becomes an intermediate technology later, and becomes a low technology in the present feature. So what was advanced technology in the 1950s, became by the 1970s and 80s intermediate technology, and today it's a low technology. So new technologies keep emerging, and we have to face the challenge. So this is what I call the disadvantage of a late start. Because we started developing technology late and we haven't spent enough on R&D, we have lagged behind for the last 75 years. And this is visible all around in India in terms of import of technology. While China or Japan, they actually absorb the technology and develop the technology. But because of weakness in R&D, we have not done that. And we've had to resort to repeated import of technology. Our expenditure on R&D is very low, 0.6% of GDP, while China spends 3%, Korea spends even more, US also spends around 3% of GDP. And because their economy is 5 times, 10 times bigger, so they're spending 20 times, 100 times more on R&D than India is doing. So we have lagged behind. Now, in this context, it is very important that, we had multilateral agreements under GATT first and then under WTO. Trump has given that up, and he's gone for bilateral things. So he said in April, when he announced these tariffs, the so-called reciprocal tariffs, he quickly said that I have 90 agreements in 90 days. So he very cleverly divided up the nations. They didn't allow the nations to come to an agreement amongst themselves how to deal with these tariffs. There was a beggar thy neighbor policy followed by each nation. Like we thought we'll get better terms because we are a strategic partner. Similarly, others thought they could get better terms and therefore they would steal a march over others. So we were hoping that our tariffs would be lower than that of China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and other competitors, and therefore we'd be able to do better. So we did not go for multilateral this thing. So in other words, Trump forced the world to move from multilateralism of WTO kind to bilateralism. So WTO is more or less sort of moribund at the moment. But the advantage that Trump gets is that we provide cheap products. Why? Because our wages are very low. So, if you compare hourly wages in the US in, say, auto sector or in aluminum and steel, then you find that what a worker earns in one day is earned by an Indian worker in 2 months, and what a Chinese worker would earn in 1 month. So we are providing very cheap products because we are also mutually competing. So if textiles have to go, they go from Bangladesh, Vietnam, China, India. So we are competing to provide them with very low, price goods. So that keeps their prices down. And what I argue is, therefore, the USA and other rich nations live beyond their means because of our cheap labor. If our labor was not cheap and we were not mutually competing, then in their economy also the living standard would not have risen as much. So our low standards and their high standards are interrelated. Now, when we think of the budget can boost demand because it's the largest single item, as I said. So to boost demand, what we have to do is we have to look at the macro. The macro comes before the micro. If the macro is not right, the micro would also not work. And at the macro level, it's the total expenditure in the budget as a share of GDP that matters. And what we find is that has been declining, actually. If you look at the last 3 budgets, from roughly around 14%, it's come down to 13.3% now of GDP as the expenditure. So if expenditure as a share of GDP in the budget is going down, that's not going to add to the demand further, whereas we need to add to demand further. So allocations would go up if we increase the size of the budget as a ratio of GDP. Similarly, the fiscal deficit leads to a boost in demand because fiscal deficit means expenditure less the revenue. So if you have more expenditure, the demand increases. So the excess of expenditure over revenue is a fiscal deficit. And there also, because interest payment is included there in the thing, if you remove the interest payment, then the primary deficit. So primary deficit is very key to boosting demand in the economy. But we find the fiscal deficit is being decreased, the primary deficit is being decreased because we are saying that we need to have a glide path to coming down to 3% of GDP for fiscal deficit and 0 for revenue deficit. So that's the thing that we have in the FRBM Act. But these are precisely the things that will actually prevent the budget from increasing demand in the economy. Now, look at agriculture. If we come to the micro, agriculture is the largest employer in the economy. And if we want to boost employment, then we need to boost allocation to agriculture. But if you look at the specific expenditures, then on agriculture and allied activities, there's a cut. It's a reduction in the revised estimate. And then in the next year, it is increased by only about 2%, which barely covers inflation. So therefore, we are not boosting the expenditure on agriculture and allied activities, which would have benefited roughly 50% of the population, would have given a lot of income at the lower levels, and therefore would have increased demand. Similarly, rural development expenditure is short by 20%. In other words, there was a rather big cut in the rural development expenditure in 25-26. And for next year, the increase is only 3%, which is roughly about the level of inflation. So in other words, rural development and agriculture and allied activities, which should have received a big boost to generate demand at the lower level of the population, that is not visible. Now, you come down further to very specific schemes like Jal Jeevan scheme. Now, we have a drinking water problem all over, but this has been cut by a massive 60%. And this is not just this year. Last year also, it was cut back. So we show higher allocation, don't spend it, then next year again we show higher allocation, then again we don't spend it. Similarly, the housing scheme, the PMAY, there also we find a similar cut that has been done. So we say that we are improving housing in the rural areas, but actually we allocate larger funds and then cut them. So like that, we find that in large number of schemes for the poor people, allocations are shown to be higher and then they're not spent. And next year again, we show higher allocation and then they're again not spent. This is a continuing feature. So not only these schemes, but also the centrally sponsored schemes where the center gives a major part of the funding, and the major central sector schemes everywhere you find, if you look at the budget at a glance, toward the last 5 pages, all these schemes are listed and what is the expenditure on them, what is the allocation, these are all given. So large number of schemes you find there are major cuts that have taken place. So to show the budget in good light, we show higher allocation, but then we don't spend that fund. And that has implication for demand. So both at the macro level and the micro level, we have problem of demand generation in the economy. Then we also find that this in totality, it means that the unorganized sector has lower allocations than what was shown in the budget. Further, there are a lot of pronouncements in the budget, a lot of promises, but action is not there. So for instance, we talk about the Atmanirbharta, we talk about Yuva Shakti and the 3 Kartavya. Now, it's not clear what these fine-sounding clauses and terms imply. For instance, for many schemes, there are no resources allocated in the budget. So in the budget speech, usually it is mentioned that, such and such scheme would have this much allocation. But in the speech, there was no allocation mentioned. For example, in the 5 university townships that are to be set up, whether setting up of the girls' hostel, whether the Bharat Vistar scheme or the She-Mart scheme, no allocations are mentioned. Also, one of the tricks that is adopted in the budget is that you announce, but don't give funds from the budget. You actually take loans for these schemes. So in other words, this also is a trick that is adopted in the budget making. So basically what was required was a mindset change. Then only we would have found the details of the new schemes which are not given. So mindset change is needed so that these schemes which are supposed to be transformative can actually work out. So how is this mindset change to occur? That cannot happen by budgetary announcements. That requires a social change. So a social political change is where, budget can be drafted in a different way. And this paucity of data in the speech, this reflects in the lack of numbers in Part B of the speech also. Part B of the speech is about taxation, about direct taxes, indirect taxes, where the tariffs will be raised, what income tax rate changes, etc. will be there. So usually it is mentioned in the end of the speech, how much would be the additional revenue gained or lost. So this budget does not mention that, how much revenue would be gained or lost by the various changes that are proposed in the direct taxes and indirect taxes. So that makes it more difficult to analyze the budget. Then, for instance, we have mentioned 7 high-speed rail corridors. Now, that sounds very good, but it also reflects very skewed priorities and a mindset which caters to the well-off. Because at present, the general trains transport millions and millions in terrible conditions. People are traveling in toilets. People are not able to move in the compartments, the general compartment. So we needed a lot more general trains rather than these high-speed corridors. So the problem is that we are catering to the organized sector, but we are further damaging the unorganized sector, and that will lead to more inequality. So this is the mindset change that we need, where we bring about, more for the unorganized sector. Then the biggest single problem of the economy is the black economy. And there are many misperceptions about the black economy. The new technology that is coming is enabling new forms of illegality to emerge. So we have been thinking that maybe we can tackle the black economy through technical change like GST and like, direct benefit transfer, etc. But newer forms of illegality have emerged, like just last 3 days from the IDFC bank, 590 crores was siphoned out. by the bankers and by the government officials, etc. So this black economy is concentrated in the hands of 3% of earners, and that results in growing inequality in the country. And because it's like digging holes and filling holes, there's a policy failure that follows. And this policy failure then lowers the growth rate of the economy. And I've shown that since the mid-1970s, the economy is losing 5% rate of growth. So these policy failure imply also a lot of inefficiency and social waste. So if you have digging holes and filling holes, it means, for instance, if you make your roads and don't put enough tar and aggregate, rains come and wash them away. So the investment doesn't give you the productivity. So in other words, what the budget speech does not address is the issue of black economy, how it's going to tackle the black economy, because the black economy can lead to a lot of resources available for government for development purposes. So we are not looking towards a solution which is just not economic or technological, but we have to look for solutions that will help tackle the black economy in a bigger way. And what is required is accountability at the top. And that is not mentioned in the budget either. So to conclude, Budget 26-27 lacks a clear vision, which will neither resolve the current problems faced by the economy, nor will it help meet the global challenges ahead. And these global challenges are really major challenges which are affecting our internal economy also. There's a threat to our agriculture and so on. So we needed to actually look at the situation differently. It does not address the challenges due to trade with the USA. And President Lula's suggestion needs to be followed. We need to give lead to the world, and we need not be scared of these tariffs that are being imposed. China has stood up to the US, Brazil has stood up to the US, and Brazil has accepted 50% tariff and continues to move ahead. But for that, we need the internal market, we need to have tackle the black economy, and we need to tackle the demand problem. And none of these have been done in the budget. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor, for that excellent coverage. Let me start with some fundamental doubts that I have, is that in the context of some of the data that you have mentioned. And before that, let me tell the audience, please put in your comments, questions in the chat box. And of course, even if you want to raise a question by audio, then you can put up your hand. All those mechanisms, you are aware of it. Okay, so you can start from now itself. Okay, let's come to the first issue itself. You clearly mentioned about the problems about data reliability in Indian government data projections, and where you said while we claim a GDP growth rate of 6.5%, it probably is actually 2.5%. Then what would be the real size of our economy? Is it $4.3 trillion as the government claims, or is it much less? Is one. And second is if also related to our management of revenues or employment generation, etc. If we do this analysis, let's say from 1970s to now, both China and India started more or less at pretty much at the same levels. And where have we gone wrong? Well, China seems to have managed its resources extremely well, and they seem to be in a far different position right now, and 4 or 5 times bigger than their economic size. And we are still, struggling to stand up against the bullying tactics of the US as well. So what is really the core strength of our, economy at the moment, if we want to do that analysis? And second, and allied to that question is, there's a student from Nalanda also sitting here. And in the Bihar elections, just before the elections, they gave 10,000 rupees to every woman. And that amounts to about 3 to 3.5 crores, if not 4 crore of people. And if you compute that amount of funds that have gone in, how does the government mobilize that kind of funding to be given to the people? One, where does it come from? How do you manage that if it's a massive deficit? for how many more years, and what is the impact of all that on actual capital expenditure or on actual infrastructure development? And this is what keeps happening regularly. So let me invite your comments on these issues.
Okay. So starting with data, that's the first issue that you raised. Our quarterly data gets very little data from the unorganized sector. The unorganized sector is huge. There are about 8 to 11 crore farmers. There are 6.25 crore micro units. There are 5.5 lakh small units. And most of the data that's used in the quarterly data is actually from the corporate sector, not the entire corporate sector, only about 300, 400 companies which declare the results. And then we actually project from the previous year to the next year using what are called high frequency data. Now, this high frequency data is also largely from the organized sector, not the unorganized sector. So I've shown that out of the 39 subsectors of the unorganized sector, 29 are measured using organized sector data. Now, what has been happening in the Indian economy is that the organized sector is growing at the expense of the unorganized sector. Take, for instance, the trade sector. In the trade sector, you find e-commerce is growing at 20 to 30%, right? Whereas the neighborhood stores are declining. The neighborhood stores are the unorganized sector. I could say a large number of middle-class people, a large number of young people, they're ordering online rather than going to the neighborhood store. And that's why e-commerce is growing at 20, 30%. So the 20, 30% growth is at the expense of the unorganized sector. But then when we look at the data, we say the trade sector is growing at this pace. So what is the declining sector, the unorganized sector? We are measuring by a rising sector. So we are misestimating the unorganized sector. Similarly, you find, for instance, in the textile sector, similarly, you find in the leather goods sector, in the luggage industry sector, the pressure cooker industry sector, that the organized sector is growing at the expense of the unorganized sector. So the declining unorganized sector is being represented by a rising sector. And therefore, what you find is that there's an overestimation of GDP. That's why I keep arguing that the Indian economy, the rate of growth of say 6.5% or 7% is only of the organized sector, is not of the economy. The unorganized sector.
Just to intervene, can I say the objective of the government is to get more business into the tax bracket? Am I right? That must be one of the most important objectives as well.
No, I think it's a false objective. You see, because unorganized sector can never become organized. Your farmers, for instance, 85% are below 5 acres of land. They will never have a taxable income.
That's right.
The unorganized sector with the 6.5 crore micro units with an average employment of 1.7 in the e-Shram portal, 30 crore have registered. When the Supreme Court scolded the government, how many unorganized sector workers there are, they set up the e-Shram portal. And the Prime Minister announced in the Parliament there are 300 million people registered. So 30 crore. And these are the better off unorganized sector workers who have access to computers. The poorer unorganized sector workers don't have access. So the figure 90% of these people mentioned they are earning less than 10,000 rupees per month. So actually the incomes of the unorganized sector workers is below 10,000 rupees per month. So that means 1,20,000, your taxation begins at 12 lakhs. So therefore, you can never get them. You can only kill the unorganized sector, but you cannot make it organized. So therefore, it's a misspecification of the problem by the government to say we'll convert the unorganized into the organized and we'll get taxes. For that, we'll have to lower the tax rate, the standard deduction and all those things. You'll have to lower the exemption limit, right? The exemption limit we are raising. We are raising from 5 lakh to 7.5 lakh to 12 lakhs now. 12 lakhs 65,000 is where you begin to pay tax. So you cannot get tax from the unorganized sector. You can only get tax from a small segment of the owners of unorganized sector, like say a panwala or like say a big dhaba wala at Murthal and things like that. But the workers in the pan shop or the workers in the shop or the workers in the the dhabas, they have incomes way below the taxable limit. So you cannot get much tax out of it. Okay. So what we have to do is think about how to measure this output, because in the micro sector, in the micro sector, there are 11.5 crore workers. Okay. In the organized sector, there are very few workers, because in the organized sector, you have a lot of automation and a lot of mechanization. So like say Maruti you take, now largely the Maruti is employing contract workers. If you take JNU, where I used to teach, for the last 30 years, it's getting contract workers, whether it be the workers in the mess, whether it be the peons, whether it be the clerical staff, they're all coming from agencies. So they are on contract. And these people have incomes below the taxable limit. So government has to see that the organized sector cannot generate jobs given the automation. Take, for example, banks. Earlier, for every work, we had to go into the bank branch, whether we wanted withdraw cash, whether we want passbook, whether we want checkbook, etc. Now everything is done on mobile phone. So work of banks has increased by 1,000 times in the last 30 years, and the workforce has become half. Okay. So this organized sector is not going to generate jobs, and especially with AI coming in a big way, even the organized sector jobs are going to decline very rapidly. So you're in deep trouble as far as getting people into the organized sector employment is concerned. So you're not going to get that. So anyway, my point is that we are not measuring the unorganized sector correctly. And therefore, our GDP is overestimated. We've been growing at more like 2.5% since demonetization, because demonetization damaged the unorganized sector. Then next year, the GST damaged it. The next year, the NBFC crisis damaged it. And finally, the pandemic. When sudden lockdown, you saw millions and millions of people marching from cities to the rural areas. Those who had migrated to the cities, they had to march back. In such trying conditions, in the heat, with children, with their luggage being towed, they were moving in very miserable conditions because they did not have savings enough to even last for a week. And they had to start marching back to their villages, So the conditions of the unorganized sector are very poor, and we're not measuring it. So I say that we have invisibilized the unorganized sector. So in data, it is invisibilized, and therefore in policy also it is invisibilized, So in policy, we don't deal with the unorganized sector. We say we have got policy for the MSME sector. But now MSME sector is micro, small, and medium. So the medium sector gets all the benefit, the micro and the small doesn't get the benefit. Okay. So therefore, my prescription has been to separate the micro sector from the MSME and make policies specifically for the micro sector, so the medium sector doesn't take advantage of all the policy that are announced for MSME. Okay. But anyway, that's besides the point. Your point was about data. So if the data is wrong from the time of demonetization, then today we are only about $2.5 trillion economy. Okay.
Oh, that's a bad news.
Yeah, and we are not the fourth largest economy. We have not crossed Japan. Okay. We are crossed only Italy. So we are the seventh largest economy, according to my estimate. Okay. So, and if we continue to grow at 2.5%, then by 2030, when the government says we cross Germany and we become the third largest economy, etc., that's not going to happen. And at 2.5% rate of growth, we are not going to be Viksit Bharat by 1947 also.
No way.
That's also not going to happen, right? So we have to, that's where the problem of demand comes in. Because this organized sector growing and the unorganized sector declining means inequality is increasing. So demand from the lower segments is not growing. And 94% of the workers are employed in the unorganized sector. If their incomes are declining, then inequality will rise, and therefore the demand from the lower segments will be very small. If you give 100 rupees to a poor person, he spent the entire 100 rupees. If you give 100 rupees to somebody who's well off, he spent 5 rupees and 95 rupees, he says, so demand will not go up. So to raise demand in the economy, you have to move towards the unorganized sector, give them higher incomes. And so that links up to your last question about Bihar. You see, the Indian public now does not believe in the political leaders. Political leaders at the time of election promise all kinds of things, but then they don't deliver. And that's why the disparities are very high and poor people are suffering. So the poor people don't have faith in long-term promises, and they say, what are you going to give me today? So like, for instance, in 2019 election, prior to that, couple of parties, they asked me to help them in the manifesto. So I helped them with the manifesto, but after the manifesto, we drafted all the right things in the economy and politics and so on. Then they said, no, we have to say, what are we giving today? Because they will not believe in these long-term promises. So political parties themselves realize. And they therefore have a short-term perspective. So there's a competition. If I'm giving 1,500, the other party will give 2,000. And if the other party is giving 2,000, then they'll announce 3,000. So, the Bihar government announced 10,000. Okay. And gave to 1.5 crore women. Maharashtra government announced, Ladli Behna scheme and so on, in Maharashtra, and they got the women to their side, right? So this is a competition. And as a result, resources with the states are short. So Maharashtra could not implement its scheme. Delhi also, they were promising various funds. They're having to cut back on that. In Himachal, they could not pay the government salaries. The government salaries are paid late as a result of lack of funds. So the states' budgets are going into a crisis. And the states are to deliver on education, health, and various other things. So if you give money in this form, then you may not get money in some other form. So the poor people demanding that, give me something in hand means that later on they'll not get something else that they should have got, which are public services, good education, good health, clean drinking water. These things will become a problem because the funds will not be there to do that. Okay. The funds, I think, in the case of Bihar, were diverted from World Bank. World Bank had some loan that was given. I think the funds were diverted from there. Now, which means that in future, the World Bank may not give funds to Bihar. And because of sovereign guarantee, the central government has to guarantee that. Okay. Just like in the case of Amravati project, in the previous budget, the central government announced the scheme, but those funds were to come from the World Bank. Okay. So, in other words, the budgets will be in a crisis if you do that. When they're in crisis, what happens? Like we've seen, you cut back on education, you cut back on health, you cut back on agriculture development, you cut back on rural development and so on, precisely the schemes which will generate employment. And you need to generate employment given the large unemployment of the youth and large unemployment of the women. And so which are the sectors where employment can be generated? Education. It's very labor intensive. A lot of teachers are required, a lot of health. Correct. We are very poor in health. We need a lot more health. So education, health, and similarly agriculture and rural employment guarantee scheme. And similar to that, we need an urban employment guarantee scheme. So funds are cut for all that. And therefore, employment generation becomes a problem. And where are we spending? In capital intensive sectors. Like our capital expenditure in the budget is going towards a railway freight corridor, big highways, power sector, IT sector, and things like that. But these are highly capital intensive and don't give employment. So earlier you could see in a road project hundreds of people working. Now you see with big bulldozers, the JCBs and cranes, hardly 5-10 people working. So even these projects are not labor intensive construction projects. Similarly, the railway freight corridor is highly automated construction. You don't see many workers working there. So that's why I argue that we have to shift focus from these capital intensive sectors to the labor intensive sectors. And when you have more employment generated in the labor intensive sector, the unorganized sector, whether it be agriculture or non-agriculture sector, or be it the micro sector or the small sector, then the demand in the economy will rise. So we needed to shift to increasing demand. And that's why our industry is saying that when there's lack of demand, why should we invest more? If I can only sell 75 cars out of 100 I can produce, why should I increase capacity to 110? My losses will increase only. So capacity utilization has to come up to 85%, 90% before investment will get boost, right? So therefore, industry itself is asking. Finance minister has been saying that public sector investment is being increased. Why is private sector not increasing investment? And the private sector says, how can we increase investment unless demand increases?
No demand. That's right.
So they are asking for demand increase. That means more purchasing power in the hands of the unorganized sector. But we are doing exactly the opposite.
Absolutely opposite.
Then the other question that you were asking was
on China
and India. Okay. What China has done is it has very cleverly spent a lot of money on education, health, etc. Okay. And therefore, its labor is much more productive than our labor. Okay.
Yes.
And, R&D they have focused on. If you remember, during the Cultural Revolution from 1967 to 1972, 73, their universities and institutions were destroyed. because Mao was saying
That's right.
that we have to do ideological training. So that
Mm.
universities and everything was set back. It is after Mao, when Deng Xiaoping came, they've started emphasizing education
Education.
again, and this
Mm.
now that in the top 10, there are three Chinese universities. Our
Absolutely.
universities are in the top 200, not in the top 10.
Mm.
They have put massive expenditure on R&D, improved their higher education, improved their school education. Okay, so that
Mm.
made their labor very productive, and because of R&D expenditures, they are now the manufacturing hub of the world. They are
Correct.
exporting to India $102 billion of trade surplus. Okay,
Mm.
they're exporting so much, and they take very little from India, so they have a surplus. So a country that we are treating like an enemy country, we are giving them
Mm.
a support of $102 billion. And that's because they are not only exporting to us high technology items, but low technology items also. So they sell
Mm.
to us Diwali lights and Pichkari and Ganesh Murti and all these low
That's right.
technology items like torches and so on, and also high
Mm.
technology items like APIs for pharmaceuticals, like electronic stuff, like automobile components and
Mm.
telecommunication equipment, etc. And many of our factories have Chinese, machines. And to
Machinery. Yes.
and to run those machines, we need Chinese engineers. So after
Mm.
the this Galwan episode, when we stopped giving visas, our factories were not running properly, and the businessmen were demanding from the government, please give the Chinese engineers visa, otherwise our factories are not
Mm.
running properly. So our dependence
Absolutely.
on China has become great, and that is
Mm.
because of the leap they made in R&D. And their logistics are very good. The scale of production is very large, so they can produce cheaper than almost anybody else in the world. So they
Mm.
have captured. That's why they were, in spite of tariffs, their trade surplus went up from $900 billion to $1.1 trillion. So
Mm.
everybody else was suffering because of that, but because of the technological advantage and the cheap exports they can do, they have been, capturing the world market. So they've captured the markets in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia,
Mm.
in USA, and so on. And they're very strategic thinkers.
Mm.
Knowing that America will stop their development at some point,
Mm.
like Biden
Mm.
withdrew the personnel from China in
Mm.
technology, like
Mm.
software and so on, right? So
Mm.
they've been anticipating that. Anticipating something like what Trump has done, they've been diversifying their trade. So their trade dependence on US has been going down. They've started trading much more with other countries. And
Other
the
countries.
reserves that they were holding in dollar through treasury bonds, they have reduced that. They've moved into
That's
gold
right.
and into other currencies. So
Absolutely.
they have not been very dependent on the US.
US.
They have been
Mm.
reducing their dependence on the US for the last 7, 8 years. Because
Absolutely.
they anticipate that one day or the other, US will try and prevent their development.
Develop.
And you can
Absolutely.
see in AI, for instance, they as soon as ChatGPT 4 came, they came out with DeepSeek. So
Mm.
in AI and software and various other fields, they have been matching the Americans. I'm told that the number of patents coming out from China is now larger than the number of patents coming out of the USA. So they
Mm.
have moved very strategically, which unfortunately India has not done. So our problem is that we have lost our strategic autonomy. We are squeezed
Yeah.
between China, Russia, and the US. We still depend heavily on Russian equipment like S-400s, Sukhois, and Brahmos.
Mm.
We can't give them up. We have $102 billion trade deficit with China because we need their equipment, etc., and we depend on the US. So we are squeezed between these three because of lack of, strategic autonomy.
Actually, we have a pseudo strategic autonomy by trying to diversify our dependencies to multiple countries. So, military hardware, for example, is on from not from excessive dependence on Russia. Now we are dependent on the French. Now the Americans are coming in a big way. So, if the Americans have they very intelligently changed their wording to say that India is committed to buying or intends to buy $500 billion worth of trade from the US, which then they say, okay, it's largely it will be aircraft, crude oil, and energy products. And what I see that is that's a way of like literally barging into your high-tech military equipment area. And once they get in, you will have no access to technology anyway, but you'll be very largely, controlled by their conditionalities. And you'll be locked into their system for the next 50 years.
So you're right.
And
I mean, for the LCA, we are using G404, and we still don't have the technology for G404. And now we are thinking of going for G414, the more advanced engine. But there's I think, tussle going on about technology. And G404 is the 1980s technology. G414
That's
is
right.
the 1990s technology. They're not yet giving us the 2010 technology, So, what we found is that with the Western powers, we've not got technology. Like, for instance, on Rafale, the French are not willing to give the
They
technology.
will not give.
Yeah.
That's true.
So the Western powers have not given technology. They have not agreed to set up facilities for manufacture in India. The Russians at least set up factories here, whether it be MiG-21 or whether it be Sukhoi. We were assembling them. We did get some technology from them, but I think the Western powers have not been giving us the technology.
That's true. They won't give it to anybody, but China has managed to leverage. Ultimately, it depends on the country's ability to leverage when you're providing them such a large business. And therefore, China was able to leverage the required technology from the US as well as the European countries. We've not been able to do that.
But I
But the
think
Russian,
all the advanced technology was developed by China because of their massive R&D expenditure.
absolutely,
Whether you look
I
at
fully agree.
5G, for instance, 5G technology they managed to develop, and the Huawei technology was very good and very cheap compared to the
Absolutely.
Western technology. And therefore, the Americans had to resort to saying that there are bugs in it. Therefore, there's security implications. Then they made Britain to back out. They made Canada and India to back out from going for the Huawei technology. But Huawei, was prevented from getting the advanced chips also. So they've developed chips also.
Their own chips also.
So,
That's right.
and
Absolutely.
China has come up with the fifth generation aircraft, and they've unveiled the sixth generation aircraft also. And that's their own technology development. That's not what Americans are giving them. So this R&D expenditure and this strategic focus that they've had, that is what underlies their
China's
technological
strength.
advance.
Absolutely. Let me come to this point about unorganized sector and agriculture particularly, and which is from what you've explained so well, the government probably should have, but even now it's never too late, should invest a lot more time and investment in looking after the unorganized sector and enabling it to be better, enhance their living standards as well as create more demand. And the India is one of the largest producers of vegetables and fruits. We are the largest producer of milk. And if the Indo-American deal now plays out and opens out the agriculture economy, and with the kind of mismanagement that we've done in terms of the unorganized sector, that could actually destroy the agriculture sector completely. And therefore, there should be a absolute no-no in the context of many factors, historically, as well as the biodiversity angle. In many other factors, I think the agriculture and dairy sector just should not be left open at all.
So, as I was saying, an average Indian farmer is earning about ₹1.5 lakh per annum. The average American farmer gets a subsidy of 20 lakhs of rupees. Okay. Plus then their own. So they may be earning 30, 40, 50 lakhs of rupees, the average farmer there, compared to the Indian farmer. And because they have technology and because of the subsidy, they're able to export much cheaper. And I remember the Indian ambassador to GATT in 1982. He told me that in 1982, the American ambassador came up to him and said that, look, we want your agriculture market. We will try and get your agriculture market opened because we have a lot of agriculture surpluses. So the Americans have been eyeing the Indian agriculture market for a very long time. And they have only 1% of their population in agriculture. We have 50% dependent on agriculture. 46% of our workforce works in agriculture. So if agriculture goes down, it will mean a lot of people's income would be actually affected. The farmers and the workers both will get impacted because the prices may drop below the minimum support price. As it is, Indian agriculturists are saying that they don't get the MSP. So there are 23 crops where the price is declared, either the MSP or like in sugarcane, there's a price that is declared by the government. Okay. But those prices are not implemented. So we know that only 6% of Indian farmers are able to get the MSP. The 94% do not get the MSP, they get below the MSP because they are very weak in the market, right? This situation will worsen when you have more imports coming from any country, whether it be EU or whether it be the US. And if 50% people begin to lose incomes, then you can see that the demand problem will get aggravated. And that is one reason why the government has brought in the labor code. The labor code was passed in 2019, 2020, but not implemented because the trade unions were protesting. But now suddenly in November, they brought it in. And similarly, they've changed the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme to this new VBG Ramji thing. Both these are attempt to lower wages in the economy because of the well-off farmers. They know that they will get a lower price, so the wages have to be cut for their profitability to be maintained. And Indian businesses will find that their incomes will go down because to export to the US at 18% duty means that their profits will come down. And therefore, they can only raise profits if the wages are brought down. So both these labor changes that have been announced, the implementation of the labor code and the VBG Ramji bill, these are to lower industrial wages and to lower the wages in agriculture, which mean the
farm labor.
Yeah, the farm labor, which will mean that the unorganized sector will further decline. And therefore, inequalities will rise further. And therefore, the demand problem will get aggravated further. The only way we can try and challenge that is by depending on the internal market, by boosting the internal market. Our constitution promises a living wage. Our constitution doesn't promise a minimum wage. A living wage more than the minimum wage, because living wage will include agriculture, not just education, health, drinking water, housing, and all these things. So in other words, if we are to improve our economy, then we must grant workers a living wage. If we don't grant a living wage to workers, then the demand will always be short. And agriculturists, the well-off agriculturists and the well-off businessmen, they would have to agree because that's the only way to boost. Once the unorganized sector demand gets boosted, the organized sector will benefit. Today, the organized sector is investing less because demand is short. When you give the living wage and the demand increases, organized sector will also benefit because its demand will increase and its output will increase and its profit will increase. So rather than focus too much on the external market, we have to focus more on the internal market. My conclusion is.
Yeah. Here's the question from Gayatri saying, thank you for your insightful presentation. As you mentioned, the growth of the organized sector seems to be occurring at the expense of the unorganized sector. In this context, do you think the new tax regime, particularly the reduced tax slabs and the compliance simplifications, will help improve the condition of the unorganized sector? Or will it further widen the gap and then on the unorganized sector?
So,
you just explained.
Yeah. Really. Our direct taxes are on the organized sector and our GST is on the organized sector. The unorganized sector is outside the direct tax net and outside the GST net. As you know, that below 50 lakhs of turnover, you're not in the GST net, and below 1.5 crore, you are in the composition scheme. Okay. So bulk of the unorganized sector is outside GST. So any GST cut benefits the organized sector, not the unorganized sector. And the lowering of the price of the organized sector will lead to demand shifting to the organized sector away from the unorganized sector. So it will worsen the situation. And similarly, if your income taxation is at 12.75 lakhs, the unorganized sector is outside that net. So that neither the income tax cut nor the GST cut benefits the unorganized sector in any way. In fact, it shifts demand towards the organized sector. So this taxation changes that have been announced are actually to benefit the organized sector, not to benefit the unorganized sector. And that benefit will be at the expense of the unorganized sector.
Absolutely. In that context, in any case, if we focus on the unorganized sector and also address some of the aspects of social change that is required, which you mentioned, uh, I think the driving push needs to come for modernization of the agriculture uh, and quite rapidly. Um, when you say modernization, I don't think it's going to result in loss of jobs. On the other hand, it will probably bring in skilled labor into making agriculture more productive and more modernized. Now, will this get impacted again by the Indo-US deal if it materializes? I hope it doesn't materialize thanks to the Supreme Court's judgment. But will that be a bigger problem? And as one of the Oxfam reports indicated last year or year before last, India turned out to be the most unequal society, and you've also mentioned that. Are we just going the way the American capitalism leads that country into oligarchic control? And precisely that's why we are ending up as well. And therefore, the inequality is huge. And with a huge population of 1.4 billion and a massive young population, are we sitting on a dynamite that could lead to a massive social revolution if things are not handled well?
So, given the unemployment situation, especially in the youth, the educated youth in the age group of 15 to 29, it is a rather dicey situation. And with AI coming in rapidly, a lot of jobs will be displaced. The situation will get even worse. Now, regarding agriculture, there are 2, 3 things that need to be kept in mind. First is that agriculture is also getting mechanized. So there's more tractors, more harvester combines, more threshers, more potato digging machines. So employment generation is not there in agriculture also. Agriculture is actually has to shed employment because agriculture cannot give more. So where do these people go? They have to go into the non-farm employment. Non-farm employment is very critical so that people can go out of agriculture into non-farm employment. That can come from the micro sector and the small sector. So that's why we need to boost the micro sector and the small sector. Second problem about agriculture is that, whatever research takes place in agriculture, and the research is very essential if we are to meet the challenge of climate change, because we need climate resilient crops. We are having untimely heat, untimely rains, etc., and crops getting destroyed. So we need more R&D in agriculture, but also we need to translate that R&D to the farm. So we used to have extension services until 1985. Those extension services are weakened. So technology transfer from the agriculture universities to farms is weakened. We need to strengthen that. So we need to strengthen R&D and we need to strengthen this extension services. Okay. And as I said, the problem of the large farms, the medium farms, and the small farms is different. The large farms have more capital. Small farms and marginal farms of half acre, 1 acre hardly have. So how to make these small farms viable? That R&D has to be done. That is not being done. So in fact, a large number of farmers with small farms are turning into workers, or their children are not going to farm work, they're going outside farming. Okay. So how to make small farms of half acre, 1 acre, 2 acre viable through horticulture, through vegetables, various other things, those things have to come up. So we have to differentiate between the problem of large farms, medium farms, and small farms, and then deal with it. Okay. But ultimately, we have to get people out of agriculture because agriculture, is not generating jobs, and that is in micro sector. Now, for micro sector, what do they need? They need finance, because without finance, you cannot do better. You need technology, and you need market. So these 3, how do you help the micro sector in that? You form cooperatives. Like, so Ichhal Karanji may have textile. So you form cooperative textile there. Then, Aligarh may have brass. So you form, a brass units cooperative. In Khurja, you may have pottery. So you make that, and then collectively, they can do marketing and they can get finance. And technology development has to come from the government. So therefore, there has to be an integrated approach, a sort of regional and local approach where you move the micro sector. You don't try and convert it into an organized sector because it'll never get converted to organized sector. It'll only get killed. So we need to change our approach. Then, so the problem of agriculture is not just of agriculture, it is of the economy as a whole. Problem of micro sector is not just the problem of micro sector, but it's the problem of the economy as a whole. So we have to think holistically about agriculture, micro sector, about reducing inequality, benefiting the unorganized sector so that the organized sector can also benefit. So we have to have a macro perspective, and that macro perspective is missing because we are pushing the organized sector without taking into account what will happen to the agriculture sector and the unorganized sector and the micro sector. So we need a more holistic thinking. And in that, the workers should get a living wage. The moment the workers get a living wage, the demand for agriculture, demand for micro sector will also rise. Okay.
Right.
So a living wage would be beneficial to the farmer, even though if I'm a micro thinker, then I'll think if I pay more, then my profit will go down. But my profit will not go down because the MSP will be determined on the living wage, not on the basis of the current wage. So therefore, the price will go up. Okay. So there'll be inflation, no doubt. The middle class will be hit. Okay. But the point is, you cannot have a higher standard of living for middle class at the expense of farmers and the workers. You should take everybody along. So in other words, a macro approach is required.
Absolutely. And here's the last question. Anupama, you can read out your question. Yeah. Unmute yourself.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
So recently, President Lula of Brazil, he mentioned that countries suffering from the US tariffs should unionize and stand up to the US so that in matters of trade, all countries are treated equally. But how should the countries go about this when we have an unpredictable president like Trump, who's, like you said, moving from multilateralism to bilateralism in trade?
So, this is something I've been suggesting since last year in March, that it should be WTO minus USA. So WTO framework still exists, and USA has violated all the WTO rules. So the rest of the countries can, get together. So, but lead has to be taken by China, EU, Japan, because they are the biggest economies. If they take the lead in getting them together, then Brazil, India, South Africa can also join. BRICS can be in the lead also, in this process. So some big countries have to take the lead. If they don't take the lead, and especially China, there should also be a promise that we'll not dump on each other. Because trade with the US will decline, everybody will have more surplus, they'll try and put it into other countries, but it should not lead to dumping. It should lead to an organized agreement that, okay, trade with the US has gone down, I have this much extra demand for goods, and I can get it from here or there. Right? So nobody should dump. That's very important. The moment dumping starts, everybody will start raising tariff. Then there'll be a generalized tariff war. So it has to be very carefully done. But Lula's idea is something that I have been propagating since last year, February, that this is the way to deal with President Trump. And then President Trump will have to back down because because US's trade will actually suffer. Okay. So US will have to lower its tariffs. Now that the Supreme Court has said that it's not Trump's power, but then he can try and use 301 or some other provision to raise tariffs, right? So that threat still exists. Okay. So we have to get together, as President Lula has very correctly said, that we have to form blocks and deal with the US as a block of countries. And because the rich nations have also suffered through unequal, they may also join. So EU is suffering, Japan is suffering, South Korea is suffering, China is suffering. So these countries together can form a bloc, but promise not to dump on each other.
That's right. Absolutely. Thank you, Professor. We've come to the end of the session today. And this we could have carried on for hours again. It's such a vast topic. But it's always such a pleasure to listen to your analysis and exposition. It was wonderful listening to the analysis on US-India trade deal and Indian budget and the overall economic situation. And I'm sure the audience would have learned a lot listening to you today. Thank you so much for sparing your time with us today. And for the closing honors, let me hand over to Anupama. Anupama, please.
On behalf of the Peninsula Foundation, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Arun Kumar and Air Marshal Matheswaran, sir, for such a comprehensive and insightful overview of our webinar topic. And I think we got to hear of perspectives that we rarely see on print or hear on TV, perspectives that require careful and in depth analysis. So, once again, I would like to thank our speaker and moderator. Next, I would like to thank our participants for being an engaged audience, and we look forward to seeing all of you at TPF's next event. Lastly, sincere thanks to my fellow TPF members for ensuring the smooth conduct of today's session. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot for having me. Thank you. All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
All the best. Thank you, Professor. Thank you.
Thanks.